Undeniably, the world remains plagued by crisis and a host of enduring injustices owed to colonial power and domination.
In turn, countless revolutionary thinkers from times past and present have identified modernity as a point source of oppression.
When taking stock of the violent ways in which modernity was and continues to be forged, the Caribbean has been ground zero. That is the crucible of modernity.
As an intervention that centers the Caribbean, this season of Surviving Society will provide a window into several of the region's grassroots struggles for land, life, and liberation.
Do you want to read books that challenge capitalism and give you tools to fight back against oppression? Surviving Society is partnering with radical independent publisher Pluto Press to bring you books by exciting young authors, as well as classics by writers who defined our movements.
Throughout 2024, you can grab 50% off all books on their website by using the code SURVIVING50. Go to plutobooks.com to check out the books.
On today's episode, we spoke with Kimberly Palmer and Nilfor Flores. Kim is an independent scholar, avid surfer, and free diver from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who works alongside Garifuna grassroots activists and the Garifuna Heritage Foundation, while Nilfor himself is a Garifuna community organizer and activist from Honduras with decades of frontline experience. Unfortunately, our interview with Nilfor about Garifuna resistance, ancestral memory, and cultural survival was lost to connection failure. We subsequently have not been able to reschedule, but hope to record another episode with him in the future. As a result, this session will focus on Kim's doctoral research in environmental studies, which centered on Garifuna struggles against land privatization and dispossession in Honduras. Good day, everyone. Today we're joined by Kim Palmer. Kim is a researcher based, as well as from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who has a long-standing commitment, as well as dedication, to the struggle of the Garinagu, an Afro-Indigenous group in the Caribbean. Situated throughout the Caribbean, it's a rather diasporic indigenous group, Afro-Indigenous group, in that the Garifuna people reside in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. There's different communities in Belize, Nicaragua, Honduras, as well as I even think Guatemala, which has to do with the historical trajectory of the ways in which different empires were configuring the Caribbean as sort of this process of forging modernity. And incidentally, I'm tuning in and as well as joining this this episode from the University of Liverpool, where one of the most serene spaces that both students and faculty go to relax and find a sense of tranquility from sort of the day-to-day grind of academia is a green space as well as square named after Sir Ralph Abercrombie. And so Sir Ralph Abercrombie was a high-ranking British official for the British Empire who was responsible for the attempted genocide, I would say, as well as I think, as well as has appeared in other literature, as well as crimes against humanity against the Garifuna people with respect to displacement, forced dislocation, dispossession, enslavement, these sorts of things. Kim, you'll inform us more accurately about what happened with respect to Baliso Island, as well as its cultural and spiritual significance to the Garinagu. But then it's one of these interesting as well as disheartening instances in which the roots and rhizomes of colonial power continue to have long-standing aftermaths and affect different geographies in different ways. In that, University of Liverpool has a university square. We have buildings named after Abercrombie. You can find different pubs as well as significant landmarks all throughout the United Kingdom that are devoted to Abercrombie. And incidentally, too, in Trinidad and Tobago, where co-producer Adaeze and co-host Johannah is joining us from, there are even major streets and thoroughfares named after Abercrombie. As we dive into the fraught complexities, seemingly the ongoing open wounds and traumas inflicted by the British Empire, I'm wondering if you can address this broad topic that we're putting under the microscope as well as dissecting for the series, modernity. And so we'll start with the question, Kim, before maybe you drill down on the specifics of what struggles for land, life, and liberation for the Garinagu look like in the contemporary moment, by just addressing this question. What is your critique or approach to modernity, as well as then to what has modernity produced in the Caribbean, both historically as well as in the present day?
Modernity continues to be forged, and that it's hinged upon an ongoing event, capital C, conquest. I'm thinking back to my dissertation research, and I was doing, my schooling was done primarily in Canada. My wonderful PhD supervisor, Anna Ford Smith, one of her PhD committee members was Shireen Razak. And so I became familiar with her work, and it was very impactful, very profound to sort of understand conquest as this ongoing event. And she analyzed the Canadian settler colonial state. And I was pretty struck by this. And in terms of the Caribbean, and then I'm from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and then live here and have done a lot of my research in the circum-Caribbean, it's like, I want to say like stuff in the Caribbean demands like a Venn diagram thinking, like it's the binary just gets shattered and there's so much complexity. So to think about modernity, like continuing to be forged and conquest as an ongoing event that functions. I'm going to reference Tiffany King here on the logic, like anti-Black and anti-Indigenous logics. But when you come into the circum-Caribbean and start asking these questions and thinking about this, it's very complex and complicated. There's not a lot of simple and easy answers. So I just think it's like a really great site to sort of think about this. And the article that I sent you kind of looks at that in a way. You know what I mean? So looking at kind of Canadian settler colonialism, or the expansion of Canada, and looking at Canadian imperialism as a concept, and looking at Canadian capital in Honduras, and looking at Garifuna struggles against, Canadian real estate speculation and various, I'm going to say situations. Oh my gosh, like various human rights abuses and like incredibly violent and tragic things that are, ongoing. And I don't mean to get kind of like emotional, but like living down there and seeing this sort of stuff, it's really heavy when I think about modernity and conquest. And I'm going to sort of like pivot onto like the situation in Honduras and looking at the sort of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous logics of colonialism, of settler colonialism, of the Canadian settler colonial project, in particular there, and people's resistance, to this ongoing project.
Okay, you've brought up several different things there that are directly tied to modernity. Of course, race and the way in which race was constructed and mobilized, used as a pretext to dispossess as well as displace people, as well as then too, you've also mentioned real estate speculation, which seemingly at the heart of this issue, maybe at the heart of modernity, is also anchored in land, as well as then too, who has claims to land, what is the significance and meaning of land, as well as then too, what are the socio-spatial dynamics of modernity? What are the ways in which the Caribbean has been arranged, as well as then too, in talking about struggles for land and life and liberation in the Caribbean, it was interesting that you were also mentioning different actors and agents from Canada. And so I'm wondering maybe if you can speak more specifically about struggles for land in Honduras, as well as maybe even too throughout the rest of the region, in particular in terms of different forms of resistance, as well as into some of the ongoing issues, because seemingly, and it's unfortunate as well as disheartening to consider the fact that when you read headlines about what's taking place in Honduras, as well as in particular about different Garifuna communities, you'll run across stories of different people being targeted, different people, land defenders from communities being abducted, forced attempts at disappearing them, these sorts of things. So I'm wondering, what are some of the dynamics at play in terms of struggles for land, defense of territory that are taking place in Honduras or beyond throughout the rest of the Caribbean, as well as in two, what are some of the major threats? What are the driving forces of these struggles for land? Could you maybe expand upon some of those dynamics?
Looking at what's happening in Honduras, I'm going to say kind of like a Caribbean angle. Like, I will say that, I don't know, I guess I wasn't following all of the US media on the caravans, right? But like I was following some of it. But, the Garifuna story gets kind of erased from a lot of that, you know, and Garifuna position their particular experience, I would say, as people who are racialized as Black in America, and then their particular experience with deportation and what it's like returning to Honduras, like, is sort of looking at this particular story, like trying to focus on it, like sheds a lot of, I don't know, a lot of light on the question of, Canada in Latin America and Canada's sort of role, in like large scale displacement and their role played in, these migrant caravans. It's particularly interesting, I think, when we look at, there's a lot of Canadian investment, or has been facilitated by the governments of both countries, but I'm going to say Canada has like a power, like upper hand in this situation, although there's some pretty heavy capital in Honduras. They got a couple billionaires up in there, some pretty heavy disparity in the wealth. And, it's like a major transshipment point for cocaine. In the midst of this, there's Canadian investment in real estate in Garifuna territory. So a lot of these lands are collectively titled. They have been recognized as belonging to the Garifuna. That titling process occurred throughout the sort of 1990s and early 2000s. It's largely incomplete. There's a lot of contestation of what was included and what was excluded. There's a lot of scholarship and activist work around what that whole titling process meant, and what it was sort of in aid of in the longer term. Because what has happened is that displacement and dispossession and the privatization of that collective territory has like accelerated. So like sort of almost collectively titling the land in one sense to sort of like, to bring it within, from the fringes into sort of like incorporating it into global capital. When I really started to kind of, with my co-author actually, who I should mention, Juan Vicente Boramayan, who I met in Honduras, we started sort of talking about some theory I was reading at the time and an artist friend of mine, Camille Turna, in Canada, and looking at transatlantic slavery and Canada, the formation of Canada and its intersection with the transatlantic slave trade. So, and then slavery in Canada, and a lot of topics that people don't kind of cover when they talk about Canada. And looking at Canadian investment in Honduras and the displacement of the Garifuna people from their territories by Canadian investors, speculating on land, buying, sort of acquiring, stealing large chunks of land and then like selling them in smaller plots to like, say, retirees from Canada, and displacing the Garifuna. When you kind of start to look at the anti-Indigenous and anti-Black logics of Canadian expansion and the formation of Canada, and recognizing the history of slavery in Canada and Canada's sort of role and, well, the territories that became Canada. And you can't disentangle Canada from the transatlantic slave trade and the formation of Canada. And then sort of looking at what's going on in Honduras is like this real sight to understand that. It makes it like super visible. So when you sort of visibilize the role of Canadian capital in Honduras, and you look at like the Garifuna's Afro-Indigenous identity and their experiences in displacement, migration, their experiences in the United States as people racialized as Black, their Indigenous heritage and their identity and their have Indigenous status, like autonomous status in Honduras, right? So they access like a lot of like sort of Indigenous rights in their struggles and insert themselves in both sort of like Black and Afro-descended discourse as well as Indigenous discourse and social movements. I think it's really like important to look at Honduras from a Caribbean perspective to understand sort of Canada's role in Latin America, and then to kind of see, like, just get a different perspective on Canada and to understand, I don't know, like to make the claim. I think it's contested claim in Canada. There's like scholars who would be like, no, like they really fight against the notion of Canadian imperialism. But there's a lot of people who say that this is a thing and, you know, make the claims and show you, you know, the research and the various trade agreements and the various, you know, get into the sort of like political science and political economy and everything of it, show you the movement of capital and sort of make claims that this is actually, you know, can be considered imperialism.
Kim, you've illustrated a lot of the complexities. Our link to the ways in which the global South, as well as then two different communities, as well as groups in the Caribbean, are effectively developing Canada, as well as then two, despite its rather well-accepted reputation as a multicultural tapestry, well-intentioned, benevolent global actor, it is one of these ironies when you start to look at statistics as well as then two, I mean, even the amount of transnational mining corporations from Canada that are grabbing land and extracting resources, primarily from a variety of different geographies across the global South. I get the sense that you're drawing direct links to the ways that's happening in Honduras, as well as then two, touching upon, as well as examining the impact and consequences this has had for different indigenous communities throughout the Caribbean, but in particular in Honduras. I'm wondering if we can take a step back for a moment. I'm thinking about the piece that you had written along with a co-author in the Diaspora. And it was about the historical trajectory of the Garifuna people. This podcast, whilst the audience who tunes into Surviving Society are primarily academics, will also find its way onto some different module and course handbooks and syllabi. So there'll be some students listening. And I don't want to question the degree to which students in places like the UK might be familiar with the Garinagu. But some of the students, I think, as well as even folks like me, who may not necessarily be well informed about the Garifuna struggle, as well as their history and culture. I'm wondering if you can maybe explain very briefly the historical trajectory of the Garinagu, where they're based, what their story is in a nutshell, if that's possible, to provide just a little bit more context as well as awareness about who this group is, as well as what their relationships and links to the Caribbean are.
Sure, I'll give you some overview. And then I know like on like when we chat with Neil for like, you know, I think that's like a great like question also to ask him, you know. I always, I think it would be great to ask him as well and hear how he takes up his own like identity and so on and so forth and understands history, because like, wow. So I can kind of talk to you like on a kind of official level, I guess, in a way, like when I wrote things, like when I write or have to do like a little introduction in an article, I'll kind of reference, I guess, the colonial record and people's like interrogation and critique of that, right? Which is like various scholars and like, I'm trying to listen more and more in any way I can to people themselves, like Garinagu themselves and their own stories, right? And so that's like, there's like a lot of sometimes difference between what I hear from people and kind of what's like in a book, you know, so that like, I think it's really like ongoing, like it's like super ongoing in terms of like, who are the Garinagu, right? But I guess St. Vincent and the Grenadines, you know, this, as we know it today, is known as the homeland of the Garifuna people, or the Garinagu, who are understood to be an Afro-Indigenous group with African ancestry and Kalinago ancestry. There is a lot of, I mean, I'm going to say most people tell me that their African ancestry comes from people who came from the continent of Africa to St. Vincent before, like, Europeans. They talk about that, like, in that way. In the sort of colonial record, there's this like shipwreck narrative, and it's like really being hotly contested right now. Like almost every kind of I go to like Garifuna conferences or different stuff, like in St. Vincent, or like when I was in Honduras, and there's like all kinds of people doing really cool work, just to try and dig in and be like, yo, the shipwreck narrative isn't making sense. So like, what else is going on here? So basically, you have St. Vincent, it's Yerume in the Garifuna language, it's the homeland, a real site of resistance against the expansion of the plantation system in the Caribbean. And I mean, I don't want to like downplay like resistance that was ongoing like throughout, but in the literature and I guess in the stories of like the Caribbean, I would say, maybe it's just because I'm from here, but like St. Vincent, like as well as Haiti, have these kind of like, okay, there was a lot going on in terms of like revolution and a lot of like perhaps interconnection. But there was a group of Afro-Indigenous people here, the Garinagu, and they really resisted British colonialism. They had periods where they formed alliances with the French. They had two major wars with the British. There's a lot of details like in between this, you know what I mean? So I don't mean to be glossing over, but in 1795, right? In the second, what they refer to as the Second Carib War or the Brigand War, the story goes that the Garifuna, so Garifuna being sort of singular adjective and Garinag is sort of like the name of like the people together as a group. The paramount chief, who's now St. Vincent's national hero, Joseph Chatoyer, was like assassinated by a British, I want to say a major, a general, oh my goodness. So the story goes. And then the troops lost morale, more and more research. There's like local, like, people in St. Vincent, like historians, like Dr. Adrian Fraser, for instance, who I wrote that article with, right? Who, saying, okay, like, basically the British targeted Garinagu, who were like, say, like, a group who had like, very varying phenotypes and like didn't like identify themselves like according to like colonial, like British, like racial like schema, but because they wanted to expand into St. Vincent in terms of the plantocracy and transatlantic slavery, the people who looked more African, were seen as more dangerous to this project to have like free African people, basically. And they were exiled to Honduras. There's scholarship that sort of leads us to sort of think that maybe this was a strategic move as well, because the British were also battling like over territory in the Bay Islands, like where they exiled the Garifuna too, or the Garinaga too. And then so the Garinagu, during this process of, this like horrifically violent exile, thousands of people were interned. It was like a concentration camp, Balaso Island, and like half of those people died there, and then the survivors were sent to this like to Roatan, which is a pretty arid island, and from there people went to Trujillo, which was like the Spanish capital at the time, and it was like that whole coast was being kind of hotly contested with the British, and they were having difficulty kind of securing the area, pretty much guaranteed the Garifuna free status. And there's various research that points to them being kind of like, being like selling their labor, whether to be like mercenary soldiers or to be, to rebuild Trujillo after a fire and so on and so forth. it's still contested, but it becomes a lot more seen as a lot like really crazy valuable because the American fruit empire, so this coast becomes sort of a sought after place. And then the Garifuna from sort of around that time have experienced some real tragedy and some real persecution. And that's continued to this day. And they've been displaced into neighboring countries. So like Belize, so you see there's like Garifuna communities all the way from Belize down to Nicaragua. And this has largely been from being persecuted in Honduras at various stages. So before the American fruit empire and this sort of like the enclave economy in Honduras, there were a couple of like very like large scale attacks on the Garifuna and continues into this day. And now so you have like major Garifuna communities in the United States of America, for example, because like this persecution is ongoing. And now it's kind of like this expansion. It's like this enclave, this tourism enclave economy, and that's sort of like very Canadian instead of like the sort of American banana enclave.
Sense of the violent ways in which modernity was forged, as well as into the lasting and ongoing consequences and aftermaths continue to this day. And it seems very much like, in a reductive sense, the story of the Garinagu is one, of course, of resistance and agency, but also, too, of being targeted for dispossession, as well as, if not, eradication, historically, as well as in the contemporary moment. Incidentally, I would say to add salt or pour salt into the colonial wound, the last time I checked, the island of Baliso was on the market for sale for $30 million US as a private island that you can buy and go to an unspoilt gem in the Caribbean.
The Garifuna still like exist in St. Vincent. You know what I mean? And like sort of question that in terms of like this kind of official like narrative of what happened in history. There are Garifuna communities in St. Vincent and the Grenadines still, and that there's lots of evidence to show that, many Garifuna who were against the British, not just sort of Garifunas or Kalinagos who were understood to be allies of the British, because I think things got like very complex, you know what I mean, during these like these wars and struggles. But we're here on St. Vincent and we're not exiled, and continue to like launch attacks on plantations and like continue to like have very really complex and sometimes hard to like I'm thinking of this colonial diary that like this I have to like get the name of the guy, but it's like this colonial diary and it's like in 1802 and this guy is like wandering around St. Vincent and he's like talking about, he goes up to Oya, like, so he's up kind of like in the northeast of St. Vincent and he's talking about, the Black Caribs, and at one stage he's like on a canoe and it's being ferried by like a Black Carib chief, and he's using this word, sorry, this is like a colonial moniker for the Garinagu, sorry, so he's using this in the diary. And then he's also talking about like attacks, you know what I mean, from Garinagu, or he's referring to them as Black Caribs as well, like who are in the hills and who are like, still like actively like fighting like the plantations of the British. This is like post the exile in 1797, like so 1795 to 1797 as it went on. But then, St. Vincent has been for a long time really being like, oh, there's no more Garifuna culture here, there's so on and so forth. But many communities where people actively and continue to identify as both Kalinago and as Garinago, in St. Vincent. And that is like constantly under threat as well in terms of like the recent volcanic eruption. So, I mean, there's been a lot of things going on since I wrote that article, but the Baliso issue kind of is like, remains the same. Like, I mean, it's like a very, important site for Garinagu people, not just in the diaspora, as it's always spoken about, but for Garinagu, like Garifuna people here in St. Vincent, And so I think like looking at it, as being, it's still, I believe, owned by the Lindley family. I think it's still owned by the family, like this family, and I forget when they acquired it, And I think it is, for sale. And people are struggling against that in various ways, but that's like, it's a difficult one. Oh my goodness, that development narrative and all of that. And I mean, it's so terrifying, but all of that is like a very real, this issue of displacement and dispossession is still like very ongoing here in St. Vincent as well.
Kim, about her research, specifically around the topics of, looking at the history of the Garifuna people, but also interacting with, on a regular basis, the sense memory of the people as it relates to the land or lands that form part of, their story. So there's the interaction of this discursive space, but then also like physical spaces that exist within the Caribbean geography. And then comes into your work that deals with the discursive space of possibility. I just wanted to give you a little bit more space to talk about that aspect of your research.
Yeah, so definitely thank you. That's what kind of bring me back to like, I guess a concept that I was like thinking through in my dissertation that I still like feel like I'm trying to understand, and the relationship between like kind of a discursive space and like a physical place, and like the kind of like the interplay between the two, you know? And I yeah, like I focus very much on like a land recuperation called Wanile, and like Neil Four is a founding member of Wanile, right? But like I was really struck by a lot of like like what was going on there. Like I got there and it was very interesting to me because it's a Garifuna land recuperation. So it's basically like, okay, so it would have been land that was stolen, you know, illicitly acquired by like a foreign investor. Um, and then the Garifuna, they have like land defense committees in the communities that are formed. And they're like, you could think of them as defenses of place. Okay. So like to bring it back to like, I'm gonna come with the space of possibility, because I saw like there was a lot of possibility going on in Wanile, which means this is ours, by the way, in the Garifuna language. So there's these land defense committees and they do land recuperations. So in the name, you could tell like it's like to recuperate the land, like it's like a recognition that that's been stolen and they're like going to take it back. And a lot of times there's these like sort of racialized like dynamics of dispossession in Honduras, whereby, oh man, and this is complex, this is very complex, but whereby people who would be like racialized as like, they would be like Latino in the United States of America and like have a very like particular experience. But in Honduras, um, wow, in Honduras, kind of like, I mean, you will hear like they will be they have a sort of like a level of like there's like a level of like white supremacy that is in Honduras and anti-blackness, like and anti-indigeneity and these logics that like, permeate the Canadian sort of displacement, but just like overall, in terms of like the nation state of Honduras and the logics that it's founded upon. But essentially, there are these land recuperations where the Garifuna are often like the foreign investor or the really sort of super rich like Honduran, like the sort of like the billionaire class has campesinos, like peasants who are Ladino or mestizo, who kind of like align, oh, I don't even know how to describe this or to say it, but there's almost like a social whiteness that they have access to, that the Garifuna will often say like they function towards like the acquisition of the land by foreigners, and it functions according to sort of like white supremacist, like anti-black, anti-indigenous logic. So I go into all of this and I feel like I don't even know how to really describe it, but I go into to say that when I went to this land recuperation in Honduras called Wanile, that was like a group of Garifunas in a land defense committee who were like fighting back against, foreign theft of their land. Right. I got there and there was like a lot of like Ladino/Latino, there'd be like Latino in the States, like recuperation members. And I had like really been, I don't even want to say confused. It had taken me like a year and a half to kind of like, adjust my kind of thinking from a very like North American, because I've been like studying and reading like a lot of like North American theory, and it definitely informed how I thought about stuff in Honduras. But I was like, oh my goodness, because often when I would be like interviewing Garifuna land defenders, they would talk about, like, I'd be like, and what about those Canadian capitalists? Like, I don't really want to like go down this road. And they'd be like, I want to talk about them later. But let's talk about like these, like the mestizo people. And they would use like a certain terminology that's like a local terminology, who are, invading, quote unquote, invading our land. And like, that's like really where the struggle's at. And then I kind of had to dive into that and kind of understand, like how like the local billionaire class as well as like Canadian capital kind of mobilized, according to these like white supremacist logics, right? Like mobilize the mestizo populace, in this sort of like, anti-Indigenous and anti-Black, like these logics that were underpinning the dispossession. You could kind of see them very like plainly when I put this kind of like looked at it through a lens of like racial capital and kind of like whiteness and white supremacy. But so when I got to this land recuperation and I saw these solidarities being forged, I was like, this is very, very interesting. And, and I started to like, kind of like hang out there and got to know people. And it was just like super interesting because a lot of the people who were there, like the founders who you're going to talk to, were people who had been forcibly returned from like living in the States. And they had like gone on these like, oh my goodness, these journeys, like in like even before the caravans, like these movements of like, people. And it's just, it's like through the desert and it's nuts, I'm sorry, and they had been in these like incredibly difficult circumstances together, going through, leaving Honduras and going through Mexico and into the States and, being apprehended and held and imprisoned together. And I had terrible experiences where they're then deported and taken from their families. The way that people started to talk about their experience together, but sort of referencing and resisting at the same time colonial racial schema. So Garifuna deportees at the land recuperation, referencing kind of like Garifuna indigeneity, but Garifuna Blackness, but Garifuna, like many different points of the Garifuna experience and quote unquote, like who the Garifuna are in order, and this experience of like dispossession and like forced return and needing the land to survive and not having any space left in Honduras because like there's just so much like large scale land grabbing or like conglomerations of like smaller land grabs, and so this Garifuna kind of hybrid or this sort of like this Garifuna in-betweenness and this discursive space between colonial sort of racial schema that they have like purposefully held open in a very sophisticated and really quite amazing manner, through so much struggle, like became a real site for being able to get actual physical bodies on the land in ways too that prescribed to Garifuna understandings of the land and ran counter to the anti-Black and anti-Indigenous logics of dispossession. Therefore, the land wasn't really, understood as owned. There were certain symbolic sort of measures taken that were far more than symbolic. So not partitioning the land, really trying to kind of ensure that the place would, remain like a very Garifuna place, but in a sense that it was also like, very inclusive, and that this understanding of who like who belonged on that Garifuna recuperation, like, was very, it was very interesting to see this sort of like space of possibility and how tied it was to a place. But then like the place itself becomes so critical. It's not just dependent on like this sort of discursive kind of work and this kind of way of like creating narratives and inserting your like struggle into these various discourses in order to like forge solidarities in a struggle over place. But then the place itself and the physical work of the place and like being in the place and like you're like on the land and there's like, people who've just come back from the States and they grew up like in a city their whole life, like in like major big city like New York City. And you just come back, like somebody just force you away from your family after you've gone through some major BS, like up there in the States too, right? Like, I'm not going to say that's been an easy ride, So people have gone through some craziness, and boom, you're back like in a very rural spot in Honduras with a lot of stuff going on. And these physical places are like, you got to learn how to like use like a cutlass or a machete. And like, I mean, it's like, it becomes this whole educational process and like a whole, like coming back to the land and this kind of relationship with the place itself and with like the people in the struggle through that place that then I think foments again that discursive space and this kind of cyclical, but it's very place dependent. I don't want to like, take away from that. It's like so highly place dependent, which is why, the physical land and these like struggles like really matter, because these kind of like cultural formations and these kind of like revolutionary processes and groups, like when you want to discuss like who the Garifuna are, like, it's very complex, I think, but in terms of like this like group of people who've been resisting this ongoing conquest for a very long time, and their particular struggles are in place.
It's something that I'm wowed at as well in terms of like doing the work in the Caribbean, and seeing the ways that groups of people, minority groups who are like in struggle and resisting against imperialism and oppression still find a way to be extremely human. And like there's this thing about even like across identities, so like you being surprised by that is something that I've been in awe at as well, and that's why I thought I felt the space of possibility was really important, and a really great term to bring to it, because I mean when people get united, that's really where you get the space for building something different, and anything is possible in that space when you unite and cross boundaries in like a way that's not extractive. So that was really amazing in terms of like telling the story. And you touched on it a little bit, but I just want us to circle back to that and for you to really like give us the picture about the ideas and concepts that exist within the Garifuna culture, from the Garinagu people, about social change, about revolutionary possibilities that we should center, because a lot of the ideas about what a better world could look like sometimes are like whitewashed or kind of rejiggered or whatever to fit like a global north vocabulary and idea. But you would have touched on some ideas that are indigenous and related to this Garifuna group that I want to give you space to talk about a little bit more, so that listeners could really kind of get a sense of what's been happening and what's been innovating in terms of peace innovation within the region.
Because one of the critiques of my dissertation, and but I thought it was like, I'm glad I did it the way I did it, but was about like maybe it's like a little like North American kind of view, like it's like very sort of binary, like I'm looking at like white supremacy and anti-blackness, but I'm like no, like sometimes like this is like shows a lot. Like I see the value. But then like when I focused on the resistance, it was very much on kind of like this kind of like, you know, like all in between and just like totally resisting, kind of like binary thinking. And I like that's just one thing I just want to like now that I'm like home in St. Vincent too, it's just like and I'm doing some other work right now with like you're probably I'm gonna mention them later too, but it's Nadia Huggins, you know what I mean? But like I've been in like kind of like looking at stuff in terms of like water, still looking at like indigenous kind of like stuff in St. Vincent and like Garifuna and like water culture, but just a view that you get different from in the water. You know, so like a more fluid and kind of like questioning the binary and like what you learn in the liminal zone of like, you know, because I surf as well. So like sort of in the impact zone of the waves and stuff. But I've just been trying more and more, like going through that whole like trying to get more in that space somehow, you know, of this like real complexity, you know, that's really defies a lot of these borders and boundaries, you know, and sometimes like I don't always like recognize it. But then at the same time, like I think, and this is probably going to sound a little bit like not really binaristic, but like, because it's not, you know? But when I was going through them like rapid fire questions, there's one about a quote, right? And I don't know if like I can actually do this, but like the quote I wanted to share, which I'll bring in now, because it has to do with thinking and like sort of like the way that people like that I saw at that recuperation and kind of like, it's like the Garifuna, I want to say like national motto, it's like their core saying, it's their core value, right? And it's Arabuni Amuru Nuni. And it's I for you and you for me. And a lot of people, when I was in Honduras, would tell me about this. Like a lot of people everywhere, like Garifuna people, like we'll talk about this and we'll really talk about it being like, you know, and I definitely what I would see at the recuperation in the way that people are like functioning, you know what I mean? So you have people coming out of like living in the States, like for example, and in like, you know, like a very money centered, like, you know, like Bronx, like New York City kind of like situation. And then like getting back to Honduras, recuperating land because there's kind of like no place for them to go because it's all being stolen. And then they're like, you know, they start to farm because like the struggle is real, like people need to eat, like it's like that, you know what I mean? It's like an actual like real physical survival thing as well. And then from there people like often trade things and like help one another out, you know what I mean, and live, right? So even the people who are like forcibly returned, you know, are living this I for you and you for me, and really kind of coming back to that. And people talk about this as having existed like for a long time in the culture, like back to St. Vincent and beyond. But then I've also heard from various Garifuna folks on the ground when I was living in Honduras that this really was like super solidified in the culture during the exile, because it was like they were like pushed like into like such extreme circumstance of survival that it was like they really like, you know, you had to like I for you and you for me, like for sure. And it's like a literal survival, you know? And I could really see that at the recuperations and just like, and you know, that contributes because it's like, it's kind of like on a micro level, like it's very like present and in the moment. Do you know what I mean? Like when you think of this, you know, it's like super like applicable, like applicable to like any situation and ongoing and can like really transform like on a like a kind of micro level, like relationship. It's relationship, right? You know what I mean? It's like relationship in like the moment. And it's like speaks to, yeah, it speaks to the collective, and it speaks to like, you know, something that you can do like towards the collective, like as like a person that you're trying to, you know. So I I don't know if that's really what you meant, but like I think that like hearing that and
That's
seeing
exactly it. Exactly.
you know, it was just, I don't know, I just thought that stuff was profound. And then like just to see like people come in, like, I don't know, it's just so, it's like that. So it doesn't matter if somebody's like, you know, because people are people. So I don't know, you're gonna go to recuperation and there's like a guy dressed like, I don't know, a guy in New York City for real, you know, but he's like with a machete and he's like doing his thing and like it just, but it's like it's indigenous. I don't know. It's just in between a lot of things and just the Garifuna is very like now and in the moment.
Okay, Kim, when you were describing um, the sense of relationality as well as collectivity amongst the Garifuna communities, as well as into their connections and relationships with land and water, I was wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit upon some of the things we were talking about earlier in the conversation with respect to looking at real estate development, the ways in which the Caribbean, different geographies all across the region are marketed, bought and sold, merchandise, these sorts of things. But then more specifically, in terms of the driving forces of capital accumulation, real estate speculation, the privatization of land, what are the ways in which those relationships that you were so eloquently speaking about have been disrupted? And even so, too, what are some of the environmental impacts of the market forces that are operating in Honduras as well as throughout the region? So a little bit more about which you've drawn a very direct line to. There is a sense of mutuality and interdependence amongst the communities that you're working with respect to each other, sort of recognizing the dignity of each other just innately, as well as in trying to kind of engage in life-giving practices by growing food, as well as in two, you were also mentioning the ways in which there's relationships with water. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe speak to some of the ways in which the environment is significant to the groups you're working with, as well as in two, what are some of the environmental impacts of some of these larger threats that you've been describing? What are some of those? And then two, what does the Caribbean as well as the community members have to gain by protecting or defending those environments and relationships?
Over in Honduras, and I was, conducting research at Wanile Land Recuperation. And like I said, Neil Four, who you're going to talk to, was not there at the time, but he's a founding member and he can give you like so much information. But his now passed away brother, who like was, a friend of mine, and like I really always enjoyed hanging out at Wanile, and he would drop a lot of knowledge. And we went down. So Wanile is like this land recuperation, like I was telling you what a recuperation is. It's just this particular one. I write about it in my dissertation. I got some like work that I like will be published in the future, like about this recuperation. And you're going to be talking to Neil for. So, but it's sort of set back from the beach, right? But, we're talking about tourism development and the Caribbean, and the fact that a lot of like the land that's most, sought after by the real estate speculators / developers, quote unquote, quote developers, is this coastal land, right? So it's land like right next to the water, and it's in this zone that the Garinagu refer to as the Larubeya, which it's this concept that like, so Neil Four's brother like took me across the road where there was like this American kind of complex, and then some various Canadian kind of investors had their like holiday homes, and there was all this like for sale land, and there was a lot of local officials involved and like the local elites involved, and there's all this land getting sold, and it's Garifuna land, and they're like, we're going to need to recuperate some of this land that's like right here on this coastal zone because it's so very, very important for us, like so very important. You know what I mean? And we have particular like ways of understanding this particular piece of this zone that extends like sort of into the water and then out of the water, but it's not so, it's not so cut and dry. You know what I mean? It's this kind of like, again, it's this Venn diagram thinking, like it's bigger than these kind of colonial ideas of like, this is land and this is water and like this kind of stuff, right? And the kind of like this interconnection between the two, and like how much Garifuna culture and even health, you know what I mean? Like, is linked to kind of like what we in Vinci would call sea blasts. So when you live in the sea blast zone, where literally like the air and water mix, like everything you're breathing is literally like the ocean. You know what I mean? Miriam Miranda and Ofrene and like, you know what I mean, was assassinated in Honduras and was defending like, rivers. And, people might highlight like, kind of struggles over rivers, because the rivers are being sold off, like even on the Caribbean coast, for like kind of like hydro projects and all of these kind of like, or being diverted for like construction uses, like for these various like sort of, enclave tourism, like developments, quote unquote. So, but like, I was like, it's like, this land struggle is like really a water struggle. And then as I got to stay longer in Trujillo, I also used to hang out with a really, really radical group of women. They were like really amazing. And they were buyes, so like spiritual workers. And they sort of like, they did a lot of work. And they also like were heavily involved in like Ofrene's work, you know what I mean? So like Ofrene's work is like, you know, they're like a land, they're a Garifuna, the Black Fraternal Association of Honduras. So they're like a Garifuna organization, very involved in the land struggle and very supportive of these land defense committees that I've spoken about. But I would be going to a lot of like protests and stuff like around like justice for Berta Cáceres and for the Garifuna people as well, and various like indigenous groups. And like it was like lots of like different, you know, social groups and like minority groups in Honduras like came together like around this cause, and like who, you know, had lots of solidarities. And so people came out and showed solidarity and were like, you know, but anyway, when I would be going to these protests, like there would be a lot of like, you know, there'd be a lot of like spiritual ritual involved, because it's like the struggle, man, it's going on in the discursive realm, it's going on in the physical realm. And I feel kind of badly to speak about this because I can't truly understand this as deeply as I would need to, because I'm not from in the culture. So I just want to state that, right? But like when I was hanging out with this group of women, there would also be a deeply spiritual component to the struggle. Like there's this like parallel struggle going on in the spiritual realm. And it's very important. So like anything to do with the physical struggle over the land, like needs to be done in a different realm as well. And when I would be with them to do certain things, when we were going to go to these different like protests around the land, or different like anything involving kind of like Ofrene and these land defense groups, like it would involve very important work on the beach, right? And like often in a lot of the sort of anthropological literature, it sort of has this divide where like women are the stewards of the land. And it's true, like, you know, Garifuna women are like farmers and like the owners of the, well, not really owners like in their worldview, but like they're stewards of the land, and men do a lot of the fishing work. But it's not so simple neither. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, women do a lot of water work as well. And like I saw that, and buyes aren't like exclusively women, but a lot of the groups, and it's this one specific Trujillo like sort of buye group, was mostly women. And like this whole land struggle hinged on their access to the water, the seawater, that specific zone where the water and the land come together and are kind of one, you know? And I was like, oh wow, it's like really like, you know, it's just like this is a very particular land and water struggle. And it's then I came back to St. Vincent, and like, so I've worked with like different kind of groups like in St. Vincent and different places, just like volunteering my time and getting involved, because I don't know, I just really like the history and culture of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I love it a lot. So I would like often be involved in like activities, conferences, et cetera, where we would facilitate visitors from Central America, so like Garifuna people in the diaspora, to come back to St. Vincent, and kind of like, you know, there's this like, you know, ongoing cultural revitalization process and like recognition of the Garifuna, like, you know, having always maintained some presence like on St. Vincent, even like during and after the exile, and kind of like so on and so forth. But there's like always this kind of like idea that most of the culture has been lost in St. Vincent, that is this like revitalization of something that's like very sort of faint, and like the typical markers of like Garifuna identity aren't like visible on the, like, you know, so like people don't really speak Garifuna language, and okay, but cassava farming, you can see this, and I don't know. So basically when the volcano erupted, right, I was like doing a lot of like food delivery, and it was like all over the place. And then I started to actually, a lot of people, the indigenous people at the Garifuna and Kalinago people, and that's a whole next set of thing. So the indigenous, like Afro-Indigenous people from like the northeast of St. Vincent, they came down to like my zone of the island, and I started, like, I know people from up there anyhow, but like I started like hanging out with a couple, like some people regular, because that's kind of far from my house normally. And we started because like there was like, man, that thing was crazy. Okay, that whole thing was crazy. So in between, like just like freaking out about this like volcanic eruption and all of like the implications, right? So I'm doing research for that article on the side too, and I'm like all involved in all this thing. And I'm hanging out with a lot of like people who identify as, I'm gonna say Carib because that's how they identify. And you could say that's Garifuna, that's Kalinago, that's a complex question in and of itself, right? But basically I'm going in the water a lot with them. So we're doing like exchange. So like they're teaching me how to spearfish and I'm teaching them how to surf, right? So we'd be like in the water a lot, and like I was just like, my mind was but alone, right? By kind of like getting in the water, and having them like really be like, this is our culture, like this is Carib and Garifuna culture for them, and being like, holy shit, like when you get in the water, that culture is like so alive. And it's just like, I mean, they're still making kind of like canoe, like maybe not in always the dugout fashion. There's a movement towards that, but these particular group, like couple of families I was hanging out with and stuff and friends. And I was just like struck by that too, because I'm doing this parallel research that's showing kind of like the displacement of like Indigenous people in St. Vincent over time and like connected to like the volcanic eruption. And there's like this whole set of thing that Dr. Adrian Fraser helped me find, and like me never even knew about like what was going on with like Carib community called Mornrond, like in the northwest of St. Vincent. But when the eruption of 1902 happened and they get moved, they write like there's this letter that goes to the King of England, and it's like, yo, we don't really like where we're being relocated to, because there's not the same access to the water. It's like a prime thing. A complaint of the land, is like there's not like we can't necessarily practice our like very aquatic culture because this land at Rosebank or whatever, like the beach is a certain way, and like what I mean, that they probably had like very specific ways of launching their canoes and doing different things, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What I mean? So I started to like really focus even on St. Vincent, because like, okay, yes, we're going to talk about Balasso, but like right now, like we just got that international airport, and tourism is like, they're going to sell off all this coastal land, I'm sure somehow, like, what I mean? It's not just the Grenadines now. You know what I'm saying? So I was like, oh man, like there's this whole other lens on kind of like Garifuna, like, or Indigenous. We don't even know how to say it because the whole identity and the way people speak about their Indigenous identity is so like varied across time and space. And it's just it defies all kind of like binaries and boundaries. So, but essentially, there's this like water component of it that I think is like very under recognized, or I don't know, maybe I'm the only one that hasn't recognized it. So let me just point all fingers at me. But where I'm like, wow. And that like, land struggle, what I mean, is like very critical to like maintaining like this huge part of the culture that I don't think is often highlighted in maybe the non-Garifuna writers such as myself and other people, and so that environmental struggle is like a very spiritual struggle. It's a very like it's a huge struggle, and it's not just land,
Thank you for that, Kim. It very vividly illustrates the degree to which the communities you work with, as well as the Garifuna people, have deep and abiding connections to not only land and territory, but also water, which is not something necessarily, like you were alluding to, that appears as frequently as the issue of land, in particular in terms of Indigenous struggles for self-determination. But then too, touching upon also the way in which different geographies and communities were impacted sociospatially by colonizers, by empire, as well as the way in which modernity ordered or arguably disordered different geographies in the Caribbean, as well as then too, what implications that had for different communities, particularly those with deep connections to land, but also, like you were very aptly describing, to water as well. Mm-hmm. But before we let you go, dive into a little segment we call Radical Knowledge Beyond the Pod. So the first question, what is your favorite quote? Who is it from? And why?
But it's like, I for you and you for me. So it sort of has been explained to me as sort of like a core value, a like uniting factor, like a very like deep and profound central organizing, like as being the Garifuna way of living and knowing and being. And I just was just really struck by this. And I have to say that, man, how can I say this? It's like, yeah, because it's towards the collective, but it does like, man, it has like just a really practical way of this making the collective in the daily, in the moment, between people, in the now, on the micro. It just seems like a really way to it speaks to action.
It's a wonderful, punchy and pithy way to me to signal that life doesn't have to be nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
It could be something else.
Yeah, for sure.
What social movement should listeners become familiar with and why?
The Garifuna struggle across the Caribbean, for like obvious reasons, is kind of like the topic of today. But like for real though, like I don't know. I feel like there's like ongoing research right now over in England in terms of Portchester Castle and like Garifuna histories in England. Like when you like analyze like the Garifuna struggle in Honduras, you get like a whole different perspective on Canada. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, like I would be like, when I was talking to some people who like studied Caribbean social movements, they hadn't really like known too much about the Honduran Garifuna social movement because there's kind of like in Latin America and like, I don't know, you know what I mean? Like, I just feel like wherever you're coming from, there's something in there, like, and it's very connected, to, I guess, well, of course, the resistance to like this ongoing project of the forging of modernity. So there's much to learn, I think, and much that people can relate to in terms of like the social movement and its dynamics.
A significant movement to engage with and become familiar with and follow. It would be interesting, in particular to me, to see what movement leaders from different Garifuna communities might have to say if they came to Liverpool and saw green spaces and buildings named after Abercrombie, and what response they may have to that. Maybe it's something that we can make happen in the future. But very much tune into as well as follow the social movement that is the Garifuna struggle. We're going to pivot to question number 3 here. So moving away from movements as well and towards literature. Kim, what book is a must-read for listeners, and why should they read it?
So I got shout out MC Marks, a poet, a writer, teacher, many things from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And she wrote a book it's a book of poetry, a poetry collection called Children of the Ash. And that is some serious things. Like there's so much talent in St. Vincent. It just brings me to tears, like honest. You know what I mean? Like the longer I stay here, I'm just like, wow, I'm just like blown away. And it's like, we don't always like get recognition or recognize, even sometimes inside here in St. Vincent. And I'm just like reading this poetry book and I'm just like, wow. And like, if you're interested in like the struggles of Indigenous people in St. Vincent, or just like all kind of social struggles and perspectives, and like seen through the lens of kind of like this like massive eruption and kind of like the questions and kind of tensions like it brought to the surface and stuff like that. It's like, NC Marks, Children of the Ash. Like it's very good. Like, I recommend it.
Find it at your local library, listeners. It sounds like it will be a moving text. A lot of people, if not all, apologies for being reductive here, but anytime I ask for a book recommendation, seemingly from someone from the Caribbean, it's always poetry, which
Really?
I have no critique of, as well as I think is a beautiful and wonderful thing. Creative expression will certainly start to move our souls, whether we hear it or in this case, you pick up the book and read it. Thanks for that recommendation, Kim. Johanna, do you want to take it away for question number 4?
What film is a must-see and why?
Well, I was talking, okay, so like St. Vincent has like, some film stuff going on. And, we have the Hiruna Film Festival, And like, there's Aiko Rudat, and there's, Ackley Olton, who I've known for a number of years. And he is, constantly through the medium of film, and just, he's constantly exploring his own identity and his own Garifuna-ness and St. Vincent's Garifuna history. And he's been to the communities in Honduras, and he recently, went to England and is doing more research over there on like in the archives, but as well as around like Portchester Castle and Garifuna prisoners of war in England, and so on. So he's been working on this film. If you go on YouTube, it's called Haruna, Land of the Blessed, right? Like, I think he's still, in working on making like a full production, but like even the 6-7 minutes short on YouTube, or like looking into who he is and his own like film production, it's like a view into Vincentian youth and like the Garifuna struggle and like the revitalization process in St. Vincent, and people like connections between like the homeland and the diaspora. And I just think that, okay, maybe that's not like a full length feature film at this moment, but it's available on YouTube. His name is Ackley Olton. Okay, so Haruna, Land of the Blessed. And I just think it's to understand the Garifuna struggle and to understand like St. Vincent today, the Garifuna struggle in St. Vincent today in all of its forms, like, you know what I mean? So like stuff in the water, but well as stuff that looks like culture on like Heroes Day, but like as well as like, youth in film, and kind of like, it's just like there's like lots of stuff going on. So I think that's like,
I'm sold, and we'll be searching that immediately. Kim, I'm sensing a common theme here for this segment of Radical Knowledge Beyond the Pod, and that is big up St. Vincent.
Yeah,
much like you were doing for as you should, much like you were doing earlier on in the episode, bigging up Honduras, as well as the different forms of resistance, political agency, and struggle that are emerging from that Caribbean geography. Now you're focusing on the geography that is St. Vincent, I think rightfully so. So we're going to move to question number 5 here. What song or musician is a must listen, and why?
Oh man, and like, I don't know, this just like came to my heart, but it's like Nasio Fontaine, like Living in the Positive. And I was like, I know he has like Kalinago ancestry, but that's not even like, maybe because my mind, like maybe it's a subconscious thing. I was like thinking about like St. Vincent and then Dominica and kind of Kalinago, and like all of this sort of like complexities around like Kalinago and Garifuna and kind of like British and like colonial kind of racial schema, and who was designated as who, and so on and so forth. But yeah, in the, in terms of like, that, there's so much possibility. It hinges on justice, and that, Caribbean people like always bring, I don't know, some kind of vibes to it, because like in truth, when I was like in Honduras, I remember like Ofrene, like Miriam Miranda, like, it's like you really see it, like, they like if they take our joy from us, like they being oppressors, that's when they win, so like it's like, but it's not just like a fake kind of happiness, it's like this like joy and stuff like this, you know what I mean? So that kind of music, like, we're on the positive, like it's Rasta, it's got like lots of culture, it's got like indigenous, like Afro-Indigenous heritage, it's got like, yeah, his own personal story of like migration to look for work and kind of the tourist economy in St. Martin. And
no, that's a wonderful suggestion, and it's I think quite obvious that the Caribbean doesn't play in terms of bringing rhythm to revolutionary praxis. On a variety of different fronts.
What artist, poet, thinker should listeners become familiar with, and why?
Well, you might vex with me because, Trinidad is, she's born in Trinidad, but like, me, I have to big up Nadia Huggins as a Vinci today. No, for real though. Like, for real, like, there is so much talent in this world, I know, and like in the Caribbean and across the islands, and you can't even see if it's true that we don't know, but you know what I mean? I just think like, just like such incredible work, you know what I mean? Just such incredible work. And yeah, and she like, was involved in stuff up with the volcano and like a photography project, like supporting like a photography project of like, folks, like indigenous folks in the OTR region, like the red zone of the volcanic eruption, and kind of like documentation of the changing landscapes over time, like pre and post eruption, and yeah, I just think that's just like some amazing photography. that like everybody should, like, you definitely can be exposed to that and not like think, you know what I mean, or feel, or like something big. So I just encourage everybody to go check them out, you know.
Okay, that's wonderful, Kim. There's plenty of content for listeners to engage with, to move and inspire, if not incite their spirits with respect to maybe striking back against what modernity has produced in the Caribbean and beyond. So, Kim, we're going to wrap there. I want to thank you for your time, as well as the ways in which you've detailed so articulately all of the different deeply layered complexities that are operating across the Caribbean, whether it's land, water, relationality, mutuality, resistance, as well as into some of the threats different communities, in particular the Garinagu, are facing with respect to cultural revitalization and breathing life into life-giving futures. Kim, thanks again, and we're going to call that a wrap for today.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe. To host or produce a series of Surviving Society,
get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.